Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this event hosted by the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire and its organizing group. This is an event for member candidates, cities, towns, and counties that might be interested in participating in the coalition for purposes of their community power aggregations. And my name is Henry Herndon. I'm a consultant, one of two consultants currently under contract with the City of Lebanon to work in partnership with the Community Power Coalition organizing group that includes Hanover, Nashua, Cheshire County, Harrisville, a number of other community and technical partners. And we're really here today to update community leaders on the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire, which is a forming public nonprofit to support cities and towns in community power endeavors. And we're here to share information about the Joint Powers Agreement, or the JPA, which is the corporate charter and the legal document that establishes the coalition, and to educate communities on how they could join and participate if they so choose. Today is March 18th. This meeting is going to run 90 minutes, or no more than 90 minutes, I should say. And really appreciate all of you joining and accepting this invitation. I'll sort of be playing MC, but this is really an event sponsored by those leading communities who've been putting in the work to create Community Power Coalition. And we're going to be hearing from a number of elected officials and town and city staff and community volunteers as well throughout this presentation. So to sort of just frame us up in terms of agenda, again, just to reiterate our purpose, we want to convene community leaders to learn about Community Power Coalition New Hampshire and its Joint Powers Agreement, and how and why they might be interested in joining the coalition by adopting the Joint Powers Agreement. There's really three sections to our event. We're going to open up with sort of welcome, purpose, expectations, and put folks into breakout groups so they have a little bit of an opportunity to introduce themselves, network around the state, and participate in the event. And in terms of expectations, want to frame this up as this is a mix of participatory informal dialogue in sections 1 and 3, really. And then section 2 is going to be more of a formal presentation. We've still got a little bit of wiggle room in there, perhaps, but yeah, sort of a mix of meeting style versus presentation style. We didn't want to just have a lecture type event here, so trying to balance those two approaches. After section 1, we'll get into the presentation. We'll discuss how we got here. So a brief overview of the past year of work that I know many of the communities here have been involved in one way or another. Talk about the vision for community power, talk about how coalition operations and governance we feel is the best way to realize that vision, and then go into a little bit more depth on this Joint Powers Agreement and how your community could join the coalition. After the presentation, definitely want to hear questions, discussion, really come back to that more participatory, engaging style of the meeting, and discuss some next steps and some forthcoming resources in our timeline. So before diving ahead off of this slide, and maybe throughout I'll do this a little bit, but if there are other members of the organizing group or some of those early adopter communities that want to chime in with comments, things I may have missed, feel free to do so. But I hope that covers our agenda.
And a great program, but then E&H was acquired by another entity which had no interest in servicing a small co-op of communities that wanted to buy green power. We looked at potentially bidding out our entire mix of retail power, so that's residential and small commercial, utilizing a broker, but discovered that, one, it was very difficult to obtain our energy data in terms of how much electricity was consumed by Hanover consumer groups, but also the brokers had a difficult time in aggregating our demand and finding potential suppliers for our electricity because we were still very small. And it was at that point that we realized, in consultation with some consultants we had brought on board from an entity called 3 Degrees out in San Francisco, that we needed to work on a regional level to look to acquire power. Our interest in Hanover is in providing green power options that are affordably priced, competitively priced for our small residential and business consumers. Other communities may have other goals relative to controlling their electricity costs, or having other services provided. But it was clear to us that the power for us was in numbers. Our strength was in numbers. And that led us to pursue bringing a group of communities together, with Cliff Below and the City of Lebanon really leading this from a brain trust standpoint in terms of understanding the power of municipal aggregation. It led us to pull a group together starting almost 18 months ago now, in the fall of 2019. And it's been a lengthy process of working with each other, getting to know each other, fully understanding the statute, working with legal advisors in the state, working with legal advisors that specialize in community power aggregations, a firm based in Washington, D.C., leaning into our advisor, Samuel Golding, spending time talking with municipal attorneys that provide legal services to the town of Hanover around the legal documents that would be required, and then finally hiring an out-of-state law firm based in DC to help us develop all of the legal documents to launch this entity. We spent the better part of 6 months in that process, from August through July through December of 2020. All via Zoom, all during the pandemic. I can't tell you how many hours we spent in consultation, and finally had documents that we felt were ready to go to the Attorney General's office for approval as a form of intermunicipal agreement. We received that approval in writing from them in mid-January, and we're off and running. And so we're here today to talk with you about how far we've brought this entity, this concept, for consideration by other municipalities. And in addition, a number of us who are early entrants are already in the process of finalizing our electricity aggregation plans to bring it to either our city councils or our town meetings for adoption. And that gives you an 18-month quick sort of a chronology of how we've gotten here. Henry. Also, wanted to talk a little bit about why Hanover has been so actively involved in this process. Henry's just put up on the screen our 4 key goals for achieving our community's goal, overall goal of 100% renewable electricity by 2030. That's not every community's goal, but that's our particular goal. And there are 4 key components of achieving that goal. The third component was to figure out how to shift all our retail electricity customers to 100% green power by 2030. And in order to do that, we realized it was critical that we create an aggregation to make that happen. The other piece, which Clifton will talk about later, is we had to get the state law changed, RSA 53E, to create opt-out rather than opt-in, to make it much easier for municipalities to aggregate their power consumption. And so we see our third sort of opportunity here as our main reason for being involved in Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire.
Great, thank you, Julia. And I think that we're going to hear from Doria Brown, City of Nashua Energy Manager, and Andrea Hodson from the Harrisville Select Board as well. Doria? Paging Doria Brown. Maybe Andrea Hodson is available to jump in.
I am. I will. I'm the select board member and a member of the Electric Aggregation Committee here in Harrisville, and we are located in the southwest part of the state in the shadow of Mount Monadnock in Cheshire County. And Henry calculated on one of those early slides that our purchase power of this group is roughly 1.6 million megawatts of power supply. And here in Harrisville, our 915 ratepayers purchase, we consume about 4,000 megawatts of that 1.6 million, according to Eversource last summer. So I'm going to share with you what I hope will be a preview of what it's like to run with this coalition, how we experienced the firsthand, the coalition advantage that provided us with a wealth of learning and a network across the state, as well as an opportunity to interact with other towns and cities with, even though they may have differing goals or differing timelines or share a border with us or don't. So again, a small town, an even smaller municipal operation powered by citizen volunteers. And when we began our quest to understand community power last May, we considered going it alone. We met with brokers to explore what their services might be. We surveyed bordering towns to check out possible aggregating options, and realized early on that it would be most sensible and best use of our time to plug into a larger cooperative effort like this, and in part triggered by just how complex and complicated the content of this, initiative can be, for those of you who've dabbled in yet. So by plugging into the coalition, we were able to see what other towns have achieved, what kind of results that helped us to imagine what the possibilities might be here in Harrisville. We picked up advice and pointers about our approach in different meetings with other town leaders. And certainly we eventually became community power explainers, for which we should get a badge. But by plugging into the coalition, it was possible for us to really understand the legislation, adapt it to our master plan, and ultimately co-author a community power plan that we are presenting to town meeting for town meeting vote this year. So the coalition members had a lot to do with our success in mastering the content and outputting our community power plan, which is on the warrant for May, within less than a year. We benefited from the technical expertise that Henry and Cliff and Samuel and others helped us to work out or to simplify. It was a meandering process to understand, but they helped us to synthesize it, helped us to write about it, helped review the content and information we used to inform others in town. So again, just key to understanding the legislation, particularly imagining the possibilities, and then laying out the nuts and bolts such that we also now have a community power plan that we feel really solid about meets the legislative guidelines, because that's a whole nother approach or factor when you're writing these plans. So in a nutshell, access to statewide networks, access to a wealth of expertise, networking with other towns at no cost. And now I think after our town meeting, if our plan is voted and authorized, we'll look forward to the prospects of buying power through the coalition.
Thanks, Andrea. And unless Doria has made it back on the line, I'm going to cover for her briefly.
I'm back.
Oh, hey, Doria. Welcome back.
Sorry for my technical difficulties here. So the city of Nashua has a goal to be 100% renewable energy by 2050. And we see community power as the way to meet that goal. Yes, the city of Nashua has 2 hydroelectric dams, but it's not enough energy for us to provide enough renewables to our entire city, though we could probably offset our entire community load, but there's some things barring us from doing that right now. So getting into community power, we also see it as a way to leverage kind of people owning private solar arrays. So they're extremely expensive. They can cost $20,000. And we know that not everybody in our community has the ability to purchase one. So we see community power as giving people access to renewables, even if they can't afford it. So as a community, we'd like to go out to bid for energy, and maybe not even purchase green energy at first. We'd like to purchase maybe brown energy and then be able to build up excess money so that we can invest that money back into our community and solar arrays, potentially expanding hydro, making our facilities more efficient, and being able to purchase green energy from that reserve fund. So we also see this as an opportunity to partner with other communities. We love that the Community Power Coalition has brought us to Hanover, Lebanon, Cheshire County, and a bunch of other communities that have really inspired us. And also it's future opportunities for us to partner and buy green energy together. So the city of Nashua, we have a long way to go to that 100% renewable energy goal by 2050, but we believe that we'll get there because of community power.
Thanks, Doria. And just sort of a final note in summary on this slide and on this vision idea. Obviously, there are a lot of communities with a lot of different goals and priorities. And part of our purpose here is to share expertise across all communities to best empower each of them to pursue those individual unique goals, whether it's Nashua or Harrisville or whichever community it might be. So moving us forward, I'm going to sort of try to speed things along and keep us on track, but I'm going to briefly now talk about coalition operations using this fun metaphor of a river to get us to think a little bit about these three spheres that the coalition will operate across. And in starting, like, what are we talking about? We're really talking about purchasing large quantities of electricity, and where that occurs is in the ISO New England regional market. So in terms of coalition operations, wholesale energy portfolio management, this is the source of most of our power. This is the headwaters of where electricity is coming from. And what's important to understand about this aspect of the coalition is the portfolio management piece. So rather than buying one single contract for 12 months or something of that nature, what we're talking about is actively engaging in the market, developing this pie chart portfolio, short-term contracts, medium-term contracts, long-term contracts that will then enable us to build our reserve funds and leverage that to build new renewables in the state as a part of that portfolio. Moving us along quickly, the second important sphere here is the rivers and the rapids flowing down from the headwaters. So state policy and utilities. This is the sphere that maybe gets a little dangerous, a little risky, a little some bumps in the road. And the way I'm going to talk about this is just by taking a moment to sort of pause and recount the story of House Bill 315. So sometime in December, somewhere in the depths of Eversource headquarters, somebody wrote a bill that gutted the community power law, that stripped away authorities, repealed and replaced municipal and county authorities to do many of the innovative pieces, and essentially sabotaged the law. And that legislation was presented to some unwitting members of the State House as a technical fix to some regulatory issues, and really put a huge threat to stopping community power. And what we saw in response to that, as all of you know, as all of you were very much participants and leaders in this, was an enormous groundswell of public and local government opposition to that bill, just from across the state. You all know this story. You were the people who were participating in this, but all of the mayors in the state signed a letter in opposition. The Association of Counties weighed in, the Municipal Association. Hundreds and hundreds of New Hampshire citizens and volunteers signed petitions and showed up to testify and wrote letters to the editor across their local media across the state. And this generated a lot of public attention, a lot of media attention, and really put the pressure on Eversource and really gained clarity on like what was really happening with this piece of legislation, and allowed really the sponsor of the bill, Representative Representative Michael Vose, and chair of the Science, Tech, and Energy Committee, to reach out and collaboratively partner with Cliff Below, one of the key leaders of our coalition, to host a series of collaborative work sessions that were sort of crunched in over a intense marathon of 4 or 5 days in this short window of time. These work sessions brought together the utilities, community leaders. The city of Keene was a big partner in this, as were many other communities, energy companies, brokers, and they all worked collaboratively over an intense week of work sessions to rewrite the law in its entirety. That law is now a net win for community power. It has bipartisan support, Democrats and Republicans alike, and it's really something that I think the state has potential to come together and unify around as a benefit for moving energy forward in the state. So the reason I want to recount the story is just to sort of show the importance of coalition's ability to weigh in on those important state policy issues, and sort of highlight, there's significant risk when it comes to state policy, and the utility companies are the traditional power brokers in that sense. And through a coalition, there's really opportunities to make more partnerships out of utilities and state policymakers, and really move state policy forward in the right direction. I'm not going to get into regulatory rules or some of these other aspects right now for the sake of time, but important to think of sort of this sphere as an important benefit of coalition operations. So you get through the Rocky Rapids and you get down to the lakes and the wells, right? This is where our communities live. This is where people settle. They build their homes. They establish their businesses. These are our energy users. And this is perhaps the most important and most beneficial piece of community power. This is where we have the potential to create value-added retail products and services. And when I say that, I'm talking about more opportunities for rooftop solar, distributed storage, time of use rates, electric vehicle integrations. These can all play a role in community power, and the coalition is a means to really maximize that value and spread those innovations across communities. I'm going to pause and take a breath just for 1 second in case I missed anything on this slide. I don't know if Cliff or Samuel or anyone else wants to hit a point, but we'll just move along for the sake of time if not.
I think you're good.
Yep.
Great, and I'll just be very brief on this one as well. Some of you may have seen this, but this is depicting the organizational chart of the coalition. Each community, whether it's a city council, select board, or a combination thereof, and its committee, forms a community power aggregation and can appoint a member to the board of directors. That board of directors will hire a small number of internal staff and oversee competitively solicited services to buy power wholesale and do other important operations, data management, etc. I won't linger on this slide, but this is for your reference at a later time, just to sort of depict what the structure of this organization is. And with that, we're gonna transition again, and we're gonna dive into the details of our joint powers agreement. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Clifton Below, Assistant Mayor in the City of Lebanon. And I won't go on and on about your many titles and roles, Cliff, but I'll just acknowledge that we're all very grateful to be working with you and your leadership in terms of crafting the legislation and leading at the State House and in the PUC and whatnot. So take it away, Cliff.
Thank you, Henry. I realized that I should put to work my experience, 12 years in the legislature and 6 years as a PUC commissioner, and really apply it at the local level. And I want to start by pointing out that this kind of idea of a joint, using a joint powers agreement to create joint action is nothing new in terms of electricity supply. There's some 70 joint action agencies across the country that serve many of the 2,000 municipal electric utilities. Those are both distribution and supply utilities, but mainly, the big piece is the electricity supply. There's also a bunch of these supply cooperatives serving electric cooperatives as well. And I like some of the slogans: community power, statewide strength, the power of communities powered by you, for you. Next slide, please. We did work in conjunction with the town of Hanover and the organizing group. The city did to issue an RFQ for legal services. We got 6 excellent responses. It took a while to winnow it down, but we did select this firm, Duncan Weinberg, out of DC, that did also engage as a subcontractor, New Hampshire Local Council. But one of the main reasons is they have a lot of experience supporting community choice aggregations in some other states, as well as a lot of these joint joint action agencies. And so could bring a lot of expertise, and we're really excited by what we're trying to do. And I should mention at this point, our city manager was sort of pressing it a few years ago when he told our group, we need to raise some money other than taxpayer money to help support this initiative and really be able to develop a business plan. So 3 years ago, our committee sought a CDFA, New Hampshire CDFA tax credit grant for capacity building. And we went out and raised $70,000 in local donations, or $75,000, and that sort of netted $60,000. And actually our legal expense here was part of our match for that. And that is what's enabled us to engage Henry and Samuel as consultants to really advance this without having to spend any significant taxpayer funds. Next slide, please. New Hampshire law has a broad provision for joint action by municipalities and counties. Any powers that they have individually, they can only exercise jointly. It does require the Attorney General to review and approve those plans for conformity with state laws in compliance with the statute. And we went through that and received that approval in January. And it's, next slide, please. Where it is structured so that we can, it's set up so we can bring on other communities that can join us. Lebanon and Hanover governing bodies have actually formally approved it. We haven't incorporated yet. We'd like a few other communities to join us as initial incorporators. The Joint Powers Agreement is a contract between the communities, creates the charter for the coalition. It includes articles of agreement for incorporating a CPCNH and initial bylaws of the coalition. And it details, has a lot of detail about the structure, board of directors, provisions for cost sharing, committees, liabilities, et cetera. And our group spent quite a bit of time working on this over the fall. The purpose, stated purpose in summary, is to enable these joint exercise of authorities with some recognized nonprofit purposes to promote the common good, economic prosperity. And I see a comment, we can circulate the full JPA and some more detailed explanatory slides after today. The idea is that we provide these supportive services, technical assistance, structured to, and ultimately promote civic engagement in our energy future. It is structured to be a tax exempt entity as a governmental instrumentality. Next slide, please. Basically the governing bodies can vote to approve entering into the JPA, and that can be done before you have an aggregation plan. There is no financial commitment at the threshold. That is something we have to work out, but that is expected to come from revenues from electricity supply primarily. It allows us to jointly solicit and contract for third-party services and staff support that are needed to really implement and operate these programs. We're looking at joint power solicitations and eventually project development opportunities. There is the authority to use revenue bond capacity, which would have to be individually approved by participants in projects, but that is a vehicle that's available to us under the statute and the JPA. We want to facilitate knowledge sharing and regional collaboration, help develop resilient infrastructure at the community level throughout the state. And very importantly, it would allow us to work collaboratively to represent interests of member communities in both legislative and regulatory affairs. Next slide, please. I'm kind of talking fast because we got a lot of ground to cover to leave room for Q&A. You know, part of it is economies of scale. What we hope to do is launch at a scale that's comparable to Liberty Utilities default service load in terms of the load and number of accounts. We could expand fairly quickly to be larger than Unitil's default service load. The participation, you know, even once you join, the expectation, and it's structured so that people could choose, you know, a full suite of services to sort of do everything soup to nuts, or there'd be a possibility of picking and choosing from a menu of services. Local governing bodies would retain authority to contract for services and electricity supply independent of the coalition, and there's no, you know, financial commitment until there's a separate agreement entered into in that regard. Next slide. We're set up to, the first 21 members that would join would have a member to the board of directors as well as an alternate. It could be an elected official, city staff, or volunteer for the community. Once we get to 21 members, we expect to move to an annual meeting in which we have a board that would probably not be as big as 21 members, but I forget the range, but there's a range that the number of directors could be, plus annual membership meetings. The board would oversee the initial startup and activities. As an affiliate of governmental entities, it would comply with the right to know law. We expect cost sharing agreements that would cover 3 areas. Member services, either the menu or comprehensive soup to nuts service, general administrative costs, which might be specifically covering some of the advocacy work and information sharing, as well as specific projects that could be developed. And Samuel can talk about the experience in California where through JPAs, communities are joining together to actually develop local renewable energy and distributed energy projects. Those agreements still have to be developed. It's important to note that it's structured so the debts and liabilities and obligation of the coalition and any of the other participating community power programs would be non-recourse to the member municipalities and counties, as well as there's indemnification for the people who serve as directors of the organization. Next slide, please. This is what I'm going to hand this off to Samuel to give a little bit more explanation. So I kind of got through my slides. Go ahead, Samuel. And I would just say we're available. You know, we've Julie and I have done this presentation to our governing bodies as well as our energy committees. We have a slide deck. We're going to continue to refine that. So we have the ability to get down into the weeds and details on this, but we wanted to get the concept across first for everyone. Samuel.
Thanks, Cliff. Okay, so the coalition is going to contract with vendors and suppliers to launch community power programs and to do so at no upfront cost to participating members, which is a common practice in the broader community power industry. What's a bit different here is the way that communities are approaching that contracting process. So as context, these programs provide all requirements electricity to customers, and that's inclusive of the energy, the capacity, reserves, ancillary services, transmission and distribution losses, congestion management, renewable portfolio standard products, and everything else required. And behind the scenes, that requires somebody to conduct portfolio risk management services, wholesale load serving entity services, credit support, data interchange with the utility, customer data management, bill calculation verification services, notifications to customers, call centers, website, and all the other advisory services pertaining to management and budgeting, rate setting, local project development support, regulatory compliance, and all the rest. So Communities that go alone often generally have to take a necessarily simplified approach to contracting for that set of services, generally by hiring a consultant and contracting with a supplier for 1 to 3 years typically. And one of the key advantages of creating a joint action agency is that it allows participating communities to take a more targeted approach to contracting for all these required services, and to afford a small number of expert staff to provide dedicated management and oversight. What we've seen is that this approach to contracting really opens the hood on how the business functions in practice. It allows a greater number of vendors to compete to provide services, and it's more transparent for the participating communities. And the outcome is a set of services that are able to better meet the requirements of those participating communities, both at launch and as the programs evolve over time. That institutional depth and the ability to evolve as conditions change becomes even more important when you consider that the broader benefits of community power programs, what they create for customers and communities, develop over time. And so we have to make sure that these programs are financially stable at launch and over time. And the immediate objective there, the first hurdle to clear, is to launch offering competitive default supply rates while accruing a reserve fund sufficient to ensure long-term financial stability, and also offering voluntary products for customers, like typically more renewable products, and net energy metering rates that allow customer generators to participate in the program. So to help members kind of balance the inherent trade-off decisions between what they set their rates at, what their renewable content is, how much to collect in reserve funds over time, the coalition and the vendors will help define energy risk management and financial reserve policies. And that's the point of that, is to ensure members are able to achieve their long-term policy goals. The other side of that is also the regulatory and policy advocacy that the coalition will represent, which can guard members, as Cliff and Henry noted about 315, guard members against adverse changes, and also to expand the authorities of these programs over time in ways that can create new value for customers and communities. The last thing I'll mention is a note on the reserve fund. These are typically, in the near term, they're rate relief funds to ensure that even as market prices change, you can maintain competitive rates relative to the utility, and that ensures you maintain a stable customer base. Longer term, you can, as those reserve funds grow, you can leverage them to self-provide collateral for power purchase requirements, and that lowers the overall cost of service, because otherwise the price of that collateral is, and the risk is priced into the power contracts. Longer term, reserve funds can grow to a sufficient size where municipalities might decide to tap them for directly funding or supplementing direct project development or local programs. Back to you, Henry.
Thank you, Samuel. And let's just see, we're doing great on time. So I'm gonna sort of wrap up and conclude a little bit, and then shift us to a discussion and a Q&A. And I'm excited for that portion. And particularly, I'd hope there's maybe some questions on a number of things, but the reserve fund and how that develops over time is perhaps something folks will have more questions on, and that could be good to dig into. But in terms of sort of wrapping up, really what this event here is today is to introduce the coalition to this network of communities and to invite you to join us on our roadmap to community power. So we aren't, assuming that every city and town is going to go home and their next city council meeting or their select board meeting, they're going to vote to adopt the joint powers agreement and join the coalition, although some of you might, and that would be great. But what we are saying is this is an open invitation, and we are available to work with your communities over the next 6 to 12 months to help you come up to speed, to know what you need to know to join up with the coalition and move your individual community power programs forward. So I'll just speak briefly about a couple pieces of the timeline here. So this isn't set in stone, but one scenario, or a likely scenario, is that the coalition begins supplying power in early spring of 2022. The reasoning for that is this legislative session has further delayed the completion of the regulatory rulemaking process, which probably won't get finalized until late summer or fall, perhaps. And that's not necessarily the most ideal time to go to market in terms of power solicitations. It's possible that the coalition will begin supplying power this year. It's perhaps more likely that spring 2022 is an appropriate goal. Over the coming several months, the coalition will plan to issue those competitive solicitations to bring on their operational vendors. And as far as all of you may be concerned, there are a number of upcoming resources that we will be developing for your benefit. And that includes a welcome booklet that's sort of just a written short overview of much of what we talked about here today as a welcome booklet for governing bodies. And then sort of for communities that really want to get involved, working on this roadmap to community power 2022. And this is more of a chapter by chapter, step-by-step guidebook to guide communities through the processes they need to implement to get their own programs off of the ground. And just to reiterate, this is, we've all been sort of participating in this conversation together just from one degree or another. This is a continuation, this is a marker in that conversation. This is a continuation of that conversation, but further technical assistance and networking opportunities will be available to those communities who really want to be the early adopters in community power. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. And I don't know if there's other sort of closing remarks from some of the speakers from the organizing group before we really go ahead and open it up for questions and discussion.
I guess I could say one more thing that I kind of forgot to emphasize on my slide, which is that the ability of community power programs to contract for new renewable and battery storage project development depends on the ability it depends. Financiers and project developers need kind of 10-year plus contracts to be able to invest all the capital necessary for those new projects. And so community power programs, in order to be a credible counterparty to those project developers, need to be able to demonstrate that they're more than likely to be around for the length of the contract term and able to make their regular payment obligations. So that's one of the key abilities that this approach to community power enables. So it's not that, for example, the reserve fund that's collected and accrued over time, that's why it's not directly used to fund project costs. It's actually directly used to make sure that the aggregation is maintains a stable customer base over time. And that's what unlocks the ability of the programs to contract for other third parties to fund those new projects.
Henry, I'm just going to add to those of us who've been working on this for the last couple of years have had the benefit of many, many, many hours of conversation. And we've become a very close working unit. But I say that recognizing that for some of you and many of you, this is sort of all coming at you in a pre-digested brief overview, which is to say, I'm here, I have staff who are here, Clifton, Samuel, DJ, Doria, Dory, we're all here. Andrea, if you feel like you just want to talk to a warm body to get a little bit more context, we're available to you because we recognize that this is a significant concept. So we don't mean to just sort of drop this on you and say, good luck in figuring out what you want to do. We just needed to do this as an initial overview to give you a sense of how far we've moved this ball down to the field to date.
Can I piggyback onto that? In the last slide, it said that, we would help with communities that wanted to explore the JPA if you're an early adopter. I would say that we'll be doing that even if you're not an early adopter. Anybody who wants to go down this line at any point will get help from the organizing committee and those with the most expertise. So.
Great. I see Bob Backus has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. I actually got two questions, but I think the one that right off the bat, are we expecting to have support, neutrality, or opposition from the incumbent utilities to this move to community power? That could certainly be a big factor. And the second one, I just wondered, the governor's proposed a new state Department of Energy, and experts like Cliff may be able to tell me whether this has any implications for moving forward with this community power project, pro or con. So those are my two questions. Thank you, Henry.
Yeah, Cliff?
I jump in and say that the utilities vary somewhat. The city has been working with Liberty Utilities quite a bit, and we feel like they've come quite a ways, and we're actually quite supportive in terms of helping turn around House Bill 315. Eversource and Unitil actually have community aggregations in Massachusetts, and so they're used to sort of the simple model of a community launching and on an opt-out basis to provide essentially default service load, but just using a broker to put that out to bid for maybe a one-year term instead of the 6-month term that the utilities are doing. Eversource, I think, had some difficulty with some of the more innovative ideas that we wanted to preserve in statute, but they kind of came around, as did the leadership on ST&E. To recognize that maybe allowing some of these more innovative approaches was okay. So I'm, optimistic that we've already sort of turned the corner with Eversource, that they're going to hopefully be somewhat more, cooperative, but it remains to be seen.
Okay. What about the State Department of Energy?
Oh, I don't know. At this point, it doesn't directly impact, the bill still calls for the PUC to adopt the rules, but, that's a whole nother story. I'm quite concerned that could really confuse things for a while in New Hampshire, but that's a sort of another story. I don't think it directly impacts us adversely at this point that I can see.
Okay.
I want to jump to Brad Roscoe, but real quick, or sorry, Samuel, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, just an observation that I would expect here, and I've seen in other state markets, that, essentially what this initiative is going to do is to coalesce and educate and engage local communities throughout the state on how the power sector functions from a competitive market structure perspective. And so that can stabilize and help to inform state level policy and rulemaking over time. So that's kind of a benefit, even though there's uncertainty in terms of how the state's going to be approaching regulation going forward. This could help to keep everything on a more even keel.
Thanks, Samuel. I'm going to go to Brad and then Lou, but before I do that, just a couple questions from the chat. Will North Country communities be able to participate? Yes, is the answer. There's a question about whether or not geography might be a consideration, but it is not. A North Country community could absolutely participate in the coalition if it would choose to do so. And another question in the chat. We absolutely will be sharing the slide deck with everyone after the fact. So look forward to receiving that, as well as additional follow-up reading materials. Brad, do you have a comment or question?
Yes, I mean, so far, all the meetings I've gone to here talked about big overviews of the plan, how things go together. The devil's really in the details, and so far, you guys haven't really supplied any details. I mean, getting a copy of the JPA and seeing what it says would be useful, but also to have the cookbook as you're talking about in the future here, to how to join, what the process is. Those are the things that it looks like you have it on your list, but no, I think this is a good thing to do, but the devil's in the details, and we need some more detailed information, and I encourage you to move to detailed information rather than overviews.
That's really helpful, Brad. And we will be following up with a welcome booklet that is sort of a written version of that, as well as the JPA and additional resources.
And we did get a bit sidetracked here for the first month or two of this year, focusing on the legislative challenge that would have handicapped us from the get-go unless we turned it around. But now that that's turned around, we hope to catch up on the details.
Yes.
And the electric aggregation plans are being finalized as well. So those will come out soon and kind of provide a more granular breakdown as well.
Yeah, that's a key resource that Hanover and Lebanon, and then soon I think Nashua and Harrisville and others are moving forward. So those will be available to everyone. Lou, who's up next?
Thanks, Henry. The JPA is a pretty daunting document, and I'm wondering, could I go to our select board at their next meeting and say, we could join CPCNH with no initial financial commitment, and take advantage of the kinds of expertise and information that CPCNH could give us, and not expect any need to contribute until and unless we actually had a functioning community power aggregation going in the town of Exeter.
That's our
So that's my question.
Yes, I think the answer is yes.
You think, or you know?
I'm sorry, just so I understand, the question is, can you go to the Exeter Select Board and suggest that they, is it join the coalition or sign up for additional information?
No, I mean, the agreement requires that the town officers sign on to the agreement, right?
Yes.
And so I'm asking, before I suggest to them or ask them to sign on to this agreement, can I say to them that there is no financial commitment to the town until or unless we are indeed a functioning CPA in the town and are benefiting from our aggregation?
Yes, adopting the JPA has no financial commitment. There will only be financial commitment in adopting a subsequent cost-sharing agreement.
Right, that I understand. That makes sense. Okay, that answers that question. One other quick question. Do we have any further idea as to how the PUC regulations may go? I mean, we've passed the 315 hurdle, I guess, but how about PUC?
So is my understanding that we may have opportunities. Well, there's a meeting coming up in April between Eversource, some of the coalition members, and the regulators to talk about how do we move the rules forward quickly and not wait for this legislation to go through the whole process. So we're expecting a collaborative, we've built goodwill and collaborative feeling with Eversource as of late, and that process could unfold over the summer and be ready for the fall.
As well as the other utilities and other sort of broker consultants that are interested in serving this market. We all worked together on House Bill 315, and a lot of that had to do with how the rules would play out. So I think we're I'm optimistic that we'll be able to help expedite the rules process in a way that works and allows us to do some of the innovative value-added services that we'd like to be able to provide over time.
Okay.
There's a question in chat. What is the comparative role of vote of select board versus vote of the town meeting? That's a good question. The select board would vote to join the coalition by adoption of the JPA. The town meeting vote would vote to adopt the electric aggregation plan that authorizes your town to actually do community power. So select board allows you to join the coalition. Town meeting is adopting your plan that allows you to do community power.
And of course, there's the earlier step of the governing board actually creating an electric aggregation committee. And if you've already taken that step, it would be good to present the JPA concept to your aggregation committee even before you're trying to finalize an aggregation plan, although you could also do it in the other order. But yeah, so the governing body has to be involved in both the creation of the aggregation and authorizing entry into the JPA, and it can go in either order.
I'm going to give a sample. Henry, let me just give a sample of how Hanover's proceeded, just to give everybody a thumbnail sketch. Our electricity aggregation committee was appointed 3 years ago, so we did that early on. But it's essentially the Sustainable Hanover Local Energy Committee that serves as the electricity aggregation committee. That was approved by the select board. The select board in January, after reviewing the JPA, recognizing, Lou, that we were making no financial commitment, but simply signing on to the entity as a participating member, authorized me to sign that document on behalf of the town. And so that has happened in Hanover. We are right now finalizing a draft electricity aggregation plan. Samuel has done a great template for us, which we are customizing for Hanover. Harrisville has also finalized their plan, and their plan's actually on the Town of Harrisville website. That will be going to the select board for initial discussion this coming Monday night. We'll then go to a community public hearing in April. And then, if all goes according to plan, will appear on the warrant for our town meeting, which I believe is now going to happen in July under COVID sort of constraints. So we are ready to provide anybody with sort of the primer as to how we did this, but more importantly, to help demystify the JPA, the Joint Powers Agreement, if anybody needs more information, and also to take a look at what a couple of communities' energy or electricity aggregation plan templates look like for either town meeting adoption or, in the case of cities, city council adoption.
In communities with the city council or some towns with the town council, that is typically both the governing body and the legislative body.
I think that Evan Oxenham from Plainfield has his hand up.
Yeah, actually, it's Lee Oxenham, but undercover of Evan. I just want to throw out a word of caution that in the legislature, we are still in the very first committee. STE is taking up 315 again tomorrow morning, supposedly with just a couple of wording changes. I hope Cliff will be available to keep an eye on that so that we can call on his expertise. I don't trust them. And it has to go to the floor of the House. It has to go to the Senate. It has to, you know, there are lots of stages in this process yet to come.
True.
I'm delighted that you're optimistic. Do you have any notion that the governor is supporting the current version?
Yes, and he did sign into law the major revisions that Eversource didn't like to the statute. But yes, every indication is that his office is fine with the amended version that we're good with as well.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat about navigating Board of Aldermen. So there's two processes here to understand. One is the Board of Aldermen or the governing body would vote to join the coalition. And then there's a separate longer term implementation process, and that is the governing body or the Board of Aldermen has to create that electric aggregation committee. And in Manchester, that could be a subgroup of the forming the Energy Commission. And then that committee develops a plan, which we have templates to support. And then that plan would then have to go back to the Board of Aldermen to be approved.
There's a question about the New Hampshire Electric Co-op. They have not been too involved with the process, but they were involved in the discussions around House Bill 315. So they're kind of, they aren't really an opponent of this because they are democratically controlled as a cooperative. I think there's in some ways less opportunity or advantage to doing a community power aggregation in the co-op territory, although it's still an option. I will say they use sort of this portfolio management approach for their electricity supply to keep more stable prices than what can happen with the utility default service. Unitil, Eversource, and Liberty all take the entire load and put it out to bid every 6 months or so. And so the price can go up and down quite a bit there. But by co-ops and existing municipal power entities typically use more of a portfolio management approach that is also what the California CCAs are doing, where this is also really taken off at large scale in California.
So we have a few minutes here. Folks have other questions. I'll say in passing, or just in the meantime, I do appreciate your comments, Brad, about concrete resources. And now that we have sort of, averted the crisis at the legislature, we will be sending some follow-ups, and I'll just go ahead and throw out, I think it's 2 weeks from today is April 1st is our deadline for this, for some of those initial booklets that are the guidebooks you're looking for, and you'll have the JPA as soon as this meeting is over.
Hey, Henry. Yeah, Everett here. Hey, if I can interject on one thing that City of Lebanon did that I think could help a lot of different people. Okay. The City of Boston is very interested in some work that we just recently did. The City of Lebanon changed out all the LED lights to with control nodes that can be adjusted. They're at 80% to start with. We should get 30 years out of these. And that's just an idea. One of the things that Clifton's been working on for a number of years. But what I'm trying to get at is not so much that City of Boston is very interested, but the idea of having more towns involved, and we're all looking for energy savings. So more communities involved will end up with better ideas in the long run. For example, we're going to be probably at $7 a light by the time we're done. That's out there on the street versus maybe $12 to $14 a light. So we're going to be saving probably 50% at least. There's a lot more to it than that, but thanks to Tad Montgomery, energy facility manager in Clifton, they set this up. I oversaw the installation, but let's just let you know that there's interest from Massachusetts up here on what we did.
And somebody asked, what if somebody joins the coalition and decides that they don't want to stay with it, that they're not going to pursue community power? It is, there are provisions for community dropping out. So, membership is not forever. You could join and then you could decide to drop out.
I'd also just kind of reinforce the point that one of the slides made, where the coalition will offer a full set of services necessary to launch and implement member programs. But the choice of which services and projects to participate in is ultimately up to the member initially and over time. So you have essentially a menu of services to choose from, and it may make sense to do certain things locally, contract for them separately, or to do it jointly through the coalition. In terms of entering into services and projects and then leaving the coalition, that would be subject to the contracts and the cost sharing agreements, but it's in general, the Joint Action Agency is set up to allow that sort of flexibility for members, which is just a common kind of best practice in joint power agency design.
And we're also looking at the possibility that membership could be just for the purpose of the regulatory and legislative advocacy.
Yeah.
Well, it's just about noon, but I want to thank everyone who's taken the time out of their day to learn more about this. And we hope that we'll be working with some of you as we go down this road.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yes. I thank everyone. Have a good day. Be safe.